Good afternoon. Good afternoon and welcome to Inside the Writer's Studio. My name is ERIC ANDREWS-KATZ and I'm the author of Tartarus. And to my right is Miss CHERYL HEAD, a career spanning more than a quarter century in public broadcasting, management, and production. After self-publishing her first novel, Long Way Home, Bywater Books has published the 3 Charlie Mack Motown Mysteries. Originally from Detroit, she now calls Washington, D.C. her home. Please welcome Miss CHERYL HEAD. Bury Me When I'm Dead is one of the Charlie Mack Mysteries. To her right is Miss Jean Redmann. She started life in Mississippi before making New Orleans her home. She is the 3-time Lambda Literary Award winner for her Nicky Knight series, Death by the Riverside being the first of 10 now. Is that correct? 9, 10 comes out in November. Yes. Mystery series. She has co-edited 3 anthologies with Greg Herron and has now started a new mystery series under the name R. Jean Reed. She serves as the Director of Prevention for the New Orleans AIDS Task Force, and she has come up with the absolute perfect answer to the question, why? See, I read your book.
Yeah.
So please welcome Miss Jean Redmann. First question, ladies. Who were your earliest influences in becoming a writer? Go ahead, Cheryl, you start.
So I'm writing mysteries because I read mysteries as a child. I read a lot of poetry also as a child. My mother would read poetry to us. So classical poetry, sort of. We would get books from my dad's second job, which was doing landscaping for these rich people. So he'd bring books home. And so we got these things called the How and Why books. People who are really old will remember those. And there was lots of poetry in it. So I remember like Christina G. Rossetti and Robert Frost and those kinds of people for poetry. And then I read a lot of Nancy Drew and the Hardy Boys, but I wanted to be one of the Hardy Boys.
I was Nancy Drew.
You were there.
Well, George and Bess, hello. I was a reading slut. Of course, you didn't say that as a child. But, you know, my parents were both journalists, and they were both writers and readers, and they wanted, so, you know, every week we'd go to the library, and of course, you know, Nancy Drew, Hardy Boys, Space Cat, you know, just about everything that was interesting. I think one of my big influences, interestingly enough, is Jane Austen, because I like her sense of humor. I like that dry sense of humor. And also, I appreciate her because she does what a lot of writers can't do, which is to pull off the believable happy end. I think that's one of the most challenging things to do. So I just, you know, reading a lot of obviously mysteries, but also just a lot of things. You know, Reader's Digest condensed books, magazines, The New Yorker. I mean, just like I say, I will if the back of a cereal box, you know.
So, Jean, how did you first get involved with the New Orleans AIDS Task Force?
Well, it started actually before. I lived in New York. After college, I graduated and I moved to New York. And I had a nicely bohemian life working in theatrical lighting. And I graduated college in 1977, which will tell you exactly how old I am. And my friends started to get sick. And it was the first wave of the AIDS crisis. And, you know, some of you probably aren't old enough to remember that, but it was this time when people just died alone. That it was a scary, we don't know how this is transmitted, we don't know how to get it, we won't bring food into these people's rooms in the hospital because we're afraid of it. And so I started volunteering on the first national hotline when I lived in New York. And then when my partner at the time moved down here to go to law school, it just made sense that I started volunteering at the No AIDS Task Force. And then I started working there. And wasn't that I planned on a career in public health, but as Camus says, it matters what you do in times of plague. And so I ended up working there, first overseeing the HIV testing program, and now I'm oversee the Department of Prevention, which does all the HIV testing, the hepatitis C testing. You know, if you go to the bars, and I'm sure some of you might have done that, and you see a bowl full of condoms, it is my staff that do that. So I do the grants and the meetings and all that sort of stuff that make those things happen.
Wonderful. Cheryl, how would you describe your work in public media?
It was the best career I ever had. It was a series of jobs. I started in college at Wayne State University. They had a public radio station that was licensed to the university, and so I was a volunteer, did a weekly talk show called Community Concern, so sexy. And from there, when I graduated from Wayne State with a degree in radio and TV and film, where they allowed me to get college credit for watching television. I was just like thrilled. Films. I started working at the public radio station there, and then moved to commercial radio for a while, and then went to the public television station. And then came to Washington to work at WETA, the flagship station in Washington. And then I took an early retirement from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting in 2009, after the politics changed the presidency and the governance of CPB.
So you've worked in public media, writing news stories and even reports to Congress. What differences do you notice between public media and fictional creative writing?
None. Sorry, you left that opening.
You know, it depends on what part of public media you mean. That's an interesting question. So I was writing a lot of, grants and proposals, and, that's a different kind of writing. It's very technical and dry in a lot of cases, although I tried to spoof it up a little bit. I sent some wonderful reports to Congress that were really flowery and wonderful. I don't know who read them. But it's a different muscle now with fiction writing, just a really different muscle. And I have to fight myself all the time with it. But because I'm writing mysteries, it allows me to really think differently, think about plot and about outline in a way that if I were doing literary fiction or some kind of other fiction, I probably wouldn't get away with. But so I've used a lot of what I learned in writing in public media to bring to at least the fiction writing, the mystery fiction writing work.
Which is more nerve-wracking, handing in a submission for a book or submitting a report to Congress?
The report to Congress. Because you had to veil your lies in flowering language.
So Jean, which came first for you in your life? Being an author, working at the No AIDS Task Force, or Greg Herron?
Is Greg in the room? No, he's not. Probably being an author. I remember writing stuff when I was a kid in elementary school and writing stories, and certainly in college. I took the obligatory creative writing courses and all that, and actually got a B+ out of D- Whedon, Professor Whedon, for the writing. So I've always, my parents wanted to be writers, but they were, the generation of my father fought in the Second World War, mother went through the Depression and all that, and they wanted to be creative writers. They were journalists, but they never really got the chance, so they passed it down to myself and my brother and sister, and I was the one that actually took the torch up and decided to sit down and write the books. So obviously the writing came first, and the writing's always sort of been this flowing through my life. It's what I do in my copious spare time, haha. And like I said, the work wasn't planned. I didn't plan to have a career in public health. That wasn't, on my goal when I was this nice, bohemian, going artsy-fartsy, living in New York City, hanging out in the East Village and all that sort of stuff. But then it just sort of happened, and so, like Cheryl, I've had to do a lot of grant writing, I've had to do a lot of report writing, and it is very different, except that the purpose of any writing is clarity and to tell the reader what they need to know. And even in reports, you need to do that. So it's always been a conjunction, and I've certainly found that my my day life influences what I write about. One of my books, Death of a Dying Man, was about a man who's infected with HIV but is dying of hepatitis, because when the book was written, there was no cure for hepatitis C. You know, so knowledge about that plays into it, but it's always been a combination, you know, and of course meeting Greg Herron, because we met down here in New Orleans, and he and I have been good friends. Who actually, our relationship is kind of interesting because he's my editor at Bold Strokes Books, but he works at the same place I do, and I'm his boss's boss. So it's like, so mutually assured destruction.
Cheryl, in 2015, your novel Long Way Home was a finalist for the Next Generation Independent Book Awards. What inspired you to write this book about African Americans in World War II?
This came from my work in public broadcasting. We had just funded Ken Burns' series called The War. It was a good series, but as I was looking at it, I realized it was the lessons and the stories in that documentary were a lot different from the stories I had heard from my father, who was a private first class in World War II. The fact that 85% of black soldiers, called Negro soldiers at that time, didn't go to the front lines at all, but stayed stateside, doing menial labor in a segregated army atmosphere. And as I did my research on the work, you know, I came to admire those men and women, because I have a WAC. There were 150,000 WACs, and 6,000 of them were Negro women. The courage and bravery it took to work in a segregated environment where you were treated as a second-class soldier and humiliated and denigrated and called names, and yet you did your work every day with courage and meaning, was inspiring to me, and I wanted to do honor to that story, so I did a lot of research.
In the book, you go into several conversations about how African American soldiers were kept away from the front lines during World War II. In years later in Vietnam, they were the first ones pushed out to the front lines. What changed?
Oh, got me. I mean, 1948, the military was desegregated by Harry S. Truman. You know, by the time we got to Vietnam, there were so many people of privilege taking advantage of the fact that they could get out of the war. It was a terribly unpopular war. Not unless World War II was a popular war, if you can use that
It was
term.
something the whole country could rally behind.
You know, 16 million Americans died, but people were, you know, lying about their age to sign up. It was a matter of courage and dignity and patriotism to be there. I think, you know, the Vietnam War is still a very tragic war, and still lots of wounds left from that war. And so I think the difference was kind of the popularity of the war, and there was a really clear line about World War II. You know, the Axis troops against the Allied troops, the bombing of Pearl Harbor, which brought us into the war. And the Vietnam War was a messy war. Who won? Who won that war?
Nobody.
Nobody.
Gene, your first book, Death by the Riverside. San Francisco Chronicle says Mickey Knight is, quote, one of the most hard-boiled and complex female detectives in print today. The Kirkus Review says, quote, Redmann has the makings of a landmark series. What inspired you to write Mickey Knight?
Boy, fell on my head when I was young. I have to remember how culture changes, and in the 80s, that was when Sue Grafton and Sarah Paretsky and Marcia Muller were starting to write female detectives, to say that, you know, women too could be walk the iconic mean streets. We could do this. We could, you know, have this sort of stuff. And so it was kind of a revolution. And I was reading those books. I'm thinking, okay, where's the lesbians? You know, where's this book? And thinking, I want to read a book that reflects me. Yeah, I enjoyed their books. And there were, I don't know if you remember, but in the early lesbian stuff, it seemed that there were a lot of mystery writers. You know, there was Catherine Forrest with Kate Delafeld, who was a police detective, Sarah Dreyer, who was doing travel agent. There was a boy, Ellen Hart, with her restaurateur.
Peggy Middlebury.
Yeah, Peggy Middlebury, you know. But and there were a few private detectives, but I wanted my own private detective. I wanted someone in the South, because it seems that every single lesbian story takes place in New York or San Francisco. And so I thought, okay, well, you know, I started the first book as kind of a short story. I was just fooling around, you know, I was young, I was, you know, way back then. And the book kind of evolved into this character. If you look at the structure of the first book, you can see that it's a little flawed. You can see the sort of that structure. But it was, how do we find justice? You know, because I think that's what mysteries are about, is how do we look for justice and find justice? And so it's saying that, you know, women can look for justice too. They can be the activists. They can be the ones searching for it, as opposed to the ones going along for the ride. And I think with mysteries, with the gay and lesbian mysteries, LGBTQ mysteries, saying we too can be the ones searching for justice, and we too can be the ones who define what justice is. Because a lot of times justice was, if you read some of the classic mystery, if you read some old Raymond Chandler, he's very homophobic. A lot of it's very homophobic. And it's going back and being able to say, no, there are different standards of justice, that we deserve justice too. And so I think that was one of the things that really made me want to go into writing mysteries, is to search. How do flawed people search for justice? And particularly if we're lesbians, how do we find justice in our worlds?
Is Mickey Knight anyway a lesbian nod to Mickey Spillane?
No.
That's the short answer.
No.
How has Mickey Knight infiltrated and or influenced the life of Gene Redmann?
Oh boy. Well, she's an alter ego. She's not me. I don't walk the mean streets. I don't, I'm an introvert. I'm not going to walk out and go just talk to people like she does. But she certainly brought me into worlds I probably would never be able to access without the writing. And, this is an example of it right here, is that I can be in a room and I can be hanging out with Felice Bacano, and I know Dorothy Allison, and talking to Cheryl and Eric, and just having this writing community. And it's taken me places. I've had books published in Germany and Spain, and I've been on a couple tours in Europe because I write books. Wow. It's something I make now. Some of us are going on a cruise in April or May. Because I write the book. So it's opened up this really just fascinating world of people who think about writing, and how do we make these creative worlds, and how do we use those creative worlds to try and change the real world a little bit.
Cheryl, do you think being homosexual is looked at more sternly in the African American community than in the Caucasian community?
I would say overall, yes. My books are set in 2006 in Detroit. Detroit is a parochial town, but it's a town that has a lot of gay and lesbian people in it, but a couple of years ago they had to cancel the Pride Parade. I mean, they just haven't gotten the steam behind the movement. In my reading, I read about being a closeted person going to my first gay bar in the 1980s. It's a little different now. I don't think it's a whole lot different. I remember reading the free papers, like our version of the Village Voice, before I left Detroit, and all the personal ads for black women were bi-curious. Like, everybody was bi-curious, and just couldn't name it, couldn't claim it, So yeah, the answer's yes.
Mickey Knight has a love-hate relationship with alcohol. At the beginning of your series, and granted, we're now getting ready to see the 10th one in November, so at the beginning of the series, it was quite relevant to the LGBT community bar life. Is it still relevant to the LGBT community, and does alcohol still play a large part in the community?
have you walked around the French Quarter lately?
In the GLBT community, not
Have
the
you
whole
walked
world.
around the Fruit Loop? Right? There's an area in the French Quarter that's called the Fruit Loop because
Touche.
yeah, gay bars. Yeah, I mean these things just they don't go away. The issues of how do we solve our problems, how do we deal with things, how do we get through life, do we make good choices about it, do we make not so good choices, do we make imperfect choices because the only choices we have are imperfect choices? You know, I do think it's still an issue. It's still kind of an issue in Mickey's life because as she, you know, like most of us, you know, sometimes we're really good. You know, sometimes I'll go to the gym 3 times a week, and sometimes I'll be, I'm doing Saints and Sinners, I'm not going to show up. You know, so like anything else, it's, you know, the issues don't go away. I hate to write them about issues because what it is how does it affect each person? And it affects different people differently. And to me, that's sort of the interesting thing about what is her relationship to alcohol? Why did she bring that? You know, one of the things when I was conceiving her originally, I kept thinking, okay, why would a woman decide to be a private detective? What would lead someone to make those choices? And so I thought, okay, this is not someone who had a really happy childhood. This is not someone who's going to have that nice, perfect, you know, sunny type life where they'd want to kind of be solitary. They'd want to be able to in control of their life. They'd want to. So that's when I thought about her and what's the reality of the kind of life that she would have. And it's in the books. I'm not going to recap all the books. You know, as Flannery O'Connor said when someone asked her, you know, what does this story mean? She said, you have to read the story. Every single word in the story counts. Yeah, so it's you know, it's you don't solve things. Sometimes you do okay. Sometimes you hold it together. Sometimes you can kind of fix things, but it never goes away like it wasn't there.
Your 10th book comes out, Not Dead Enough, in November of this year.
Mm-hmm.
And not that we're advocating for it at all, but do you ever think I should probably end the series sooner or later?
Well, it's something that those of us who write series sort of throw out, is what's the appropriate time to end the series. And I figure as long as I'm still interested and as long as I still have a story that engages me and that I hopefully will engage the readers, I can still write it. You know, at some point maybe I will end it, but, you know, I'm not quite there yet.
Cheryl, you once said that with your Charlie Mack series, you wanted to, quote, attract a broader audience, not just readers of lesbian fiction. Mm-hmm. Have you done that, and what steps have you taken to promote a crossover audience?
Mm-hmm. So I think it was last year at Saints and Sinners, I was with my buds, Elizabeth and Carol, and we were walking around the French Quarter, and we were talking about the success of writers and the success of the series. And I don't know if you guys recall, I said, I want my books to be in that little shop in the airport when you on the little carousel. You know, that's, to me, that's mainstreaming our work. I think, you know, our lives and our stories deserve to get a broader readership. I'm really placing myself in the spaces now where mystery writers per se are. It's very white, it's very male. I just bust in the door and I put myself in their faces. I do all my homework. I've read the genre a lot, so I could go toe-to-toe with them on what it means and what noir means and Raymond Chandler. But I'm also trying to teach that broader mystery field that there are lots of writers of color who are writing mysteries that are really fine mysteries. Some of them set in LA like Raymond Chandler's, you know, written by Japanese Americans. Some of, you know, Walter Mosley is one person that we can all name, but there are lots of other brand new male writers, some of them gay, some of them not, who are writing superb mysteries. And it's like every other kind of landscape and organization and kind of industry that I'm coming across right now. They're all looking at how they can become more diverse. And they're relying on the people who are in the room to help them with that. It's really hard to change. Public broadcasting, which looks like this big liberal space with Mr. Rogers and, and all that stuff, it's been very difficult for them to come around to accepting the diversity in our country in the sense that they will let us be gatekeepers. So the last piece of work I was doing there was pushing for diversity and inclusion. I did it for 20 years, to the point where after they said, Cheryl, we're going to have a diversity meeting. Do you want to come? And I said, no. Are we going to talk about that same shit we were talking about 5 years ago? Yeah. I actually left public broadcasting for about 4 years, and I came back to it, and it was like I had gone to the ladies' room and come back out. They were saying the same shit about the same issues with the same people, and it was totally frustrating. So I'm going to be at BelcherCon. I was there with you. That's a huge mystery writers conference with readers and writers. Last week in Chicago, I taught a class on how to write people who are not like us to a group of white mystery writers in the room. And that's the kind of work I'm going to be doing.
2017 saw your publication of Bury Me When I'm Dead. Quote, Bury Me When I'm Dead is a compelling tale from an intriguing new writer, says Elizabeth Sims of the Lillian Bird Mystery Series. It was a 2017 Lambda Literary finalist. So after your World War II novel, Long Way Home, what made you decide to go into being a mystery writer?
Spending hours in the Library of Congress, writing that history piece. I just wanted to write something fun, and mysteries are fun for me. I like puzzles. I read mysteries. I kind of understand the genre. I whipped out that book in about, 9 months or something like that. It had a different title. I just put it on Amazon. I'm going to write it and put it on Amazon. And publisher came to me and said, I read the book. Have you ever thought, is Charlie a lesbian? And I said, she could be. So I went back to my beta reader, and they said, oh yeah, we thought she was a lesbian. In mystery writing, there's not a lot of sex. It's, the hard-boiled mystery books are not about sex. So I had to put 3 sex scenes in there, which was a great, I should have called you Dorothy. I didn't know.
Practice makes perfect.
My kid is one of my beta readers, and I gave her the book to read. She calls me. She goes like, "Okay, Mom, I'm not going to read this book unless you put a little flag on there that says sex scene next."
Next question is for both of you. Story location is extremely important. Jean, you used New Orleans for your series, and Cheryl, you used Detroit. You even put Detroit in the dedication of your book.
Detroit swagger, yeah.
So explain how the story location becomes its own entity and therefore its own character.
I'll go first. Okay. So, for me, Detroit is a bellwether city in the United States of America. I think there are lots of bellwether cities, and I think Detroit is one of them, and here's why. So during World War II, Detroit was called the arsenal of democracy. We were making tanks and planes in the car factories that had been refitted to make these military vehicles. Henry Ford, as racist as he is and was a great innovator. He came up with the idea of the
assembly line.
Thank you, ladies. The assembly line. It's a place where manufacturing really took hold in the United States, and lots of people made millions of dollars. It's a place, you guys talked about Detroit earlier today. It's a place where lots of revolution took place. So I think of it as a place where it kind of signals some of the social issues that the United States is going to have writ large. I mean, we had a race riot in Detroit in 1948. Then we had another one in 1967. It's a place where the races are polarized, and it takes great consciousness and commitment to talk about the race and the racial divides that we have in the United States. And Detroit's always been a place where that conversation has been front and center.
Jean, how has New Orleans become a character in your book?
Well, New Orleans is, as you may have noticed, one of the least American of American cities. And it's also a city with, you know, so much is possible. Anything can happen in New Orleans. You can have a little, you know, you're walking down the street and there's a voodoo ceremony going on. This has happened. It's also a historical city, and it has all the richness of history, and it has all the flaws of history. If you, and just knowing that, for example, it used to be that it was a segregated city, and if you're African American, you could shop on Canal Street to the north of Rampart Street, but you couldn't walk down across Canal Street below Rampart Street. And so if you know this, you understand, some of why those boundary lines are so important these days. That Canal Street for a long time was the shopping center, the shopping area, the high-tony shopping area of New Orleans. It's not anymore. And it has so much character in terms of the different kind of influences, the different kind of histories, the different kinds of peoples that have come through here. You've got, the French, the Spanish. You've got, of course, the what they call the Kentucks, the Americans that came down after the Louisiana Purchase. You've got all these different sort of things. And one of the fascinating things about New Orleans is my wife, who's a historian, who's music history, was doing some research, and she's doing research in other places. And most of those cities have a you can't do this, moral reform. We don't want you having sell drinks in theaters because we don't want drunken people in these theaters. Or you can't do this because New Orleans was New Orleans was, oh, how do we tax it? We don't care what you do. Tax it. We're just going to come up with some way to tax it. You have your coffee shops, you have your drink, and you can see it today. If you walk, I tell people, be careful because there is no last call. So if you're hoping for last call to tell you when to leave the bar, good luck. You're going to be going like, what's that bright thing out there? Oh my God, that's the sun.
Can I just say one thing about New Orleans too? Because I think New Orleans is another one of our bellwether cities.
Yeah.
I don't know about the rest of you, but away from New Orleans, when Katrina happened, it felt like an American tragedy, and we lived with that for. You guys really lived with it, but.
Yeah.
It said a lot about what we think about people of color. It said a lot about how we use money and who gets money and who gets to be saved and who doesn't. I mean, look at Puerto Rico now.
Yeah,
we have done exactly the same thing as we did.
Yes,
except you guys got a little bit more money, but it's interesting.
So from the first of your series to the most current one that you've written so far, how has your main character, changed?
She's gotten older.
That's all?
It's so hard because you write the book, and the first book came out in 1990. So, and I have the day job and all that sort of stuff. And so, a couple of years go by, you write another book. A couple of years go by, you write another book. And it's, when readers tell me, oh, I just read all your books in series, I'm like, oh God, please don't do that. Because you're going to find out every single flaw and all the things that I forgot or didn't do right. I do think she's gotten older. She's gotten a little bit wiser. Been through some ups and downs. One of the beautiful things about fiction is that I don't have to age her the same way I age. So that, you can have, for us, all of us in the real world, it's every year is a year. You get a year older no matter what you want to do. In fictional time, it's like, she still can be in her 40s. I don't need to make her, as old as I am. I think she's changed in ways that I've changed. I was much younger. I was in my 30s when I wrote the first book. I'm not in my 30s anymore. The past is a distant country we can never revisit. And so I can't go back to that particular person who wrote those books. I can only be the person I am now, writing the books now with the way I think about the character now. So other than, she's solved some things. She's not quite as volatile as she was in the beginning, but, obviously she's got to still have a bit of drama going on, otherwise, it'd be boring to read.
She seems more grounded. That's one thing I've noticed, because I've been able to read, like, first couple of books in your series, and I've noticed that she seems more grounded. She still has her volatile points of view, and she definitely is a flawed character, which is human, but she just seems to be, as you said, getting older and therefore more grounded.
Yeah, I mean, you can't keep characters in perpetual. They've got to have a movement to them. They've got to have a way, way to go. And that's one of the things that fascinated about me. This character is, she's starting in this very flawed, broken place, and starting to try and put herself together and figure out, the problems she has in her life. And how does she do this while she's still in this private detective world of searching for justice? So, again, my interest is, how do flawed people look for justice, and what's the difference between those who actually search for justice, or to search to do the right thing, and those who sort of slide off the edge and take the easy path or the greedy path, and how do they justify it?
And Cheryl, I know that you've written 3 so far, and your 4th one's just completed?
4th one's out in October.
4th one's out in October. How has Charlie Mack changed over the 4 series so far?
Well, Charlie is, she lives in 2005 and 2006 Detroit, which is when the series is set, and is questioning her sexuality at the beginning of the series in book 1. She meets the person who will be the love of her life, and in book 2, book 3, they're moving in. The one that just came out, they're moving in together. So she's a little more clear about how she wants to spend her life. Her sexual, she eschews the title of lesbian. She eschews the title of bisexual. But Mandy Porter, her love interest, makes it a clear line for her that she wants to love this woman. She takes care of her aging mother who has early onset Alzheimer's. And so I'm working with my editor about how much to progress the story, because we like the character of the mother, Ernestine, and we don't want her to go over the edge too fast. So that's one of the things I'm grappling with, about how fast I'll move the series. But for me, it makes just common sense to me that black women would be private investigators. We are always taking little bits of shit and putting it together and making a whole lot of it. Shifting priorities, looking through the bullshit, going like, I see you. So it just seemed like a natural progression that I would write about this kick-ass black lesbian private investigator who has her own firm and several partners that she's in charge of.
George Martin, who wrote Game of Thrones, once said, quote, "There are gay people in the world, so I thought there should be some in mine."
Yes, exactly right.
Is there enough diversity in the mystery gene, and how do we, it's starting to change, but how do we bring more diversity into our fields?
Oh boy. Well, it's hard because we're trained from the early age to think of heroes as a certain group of people. The ones we read in school, straight white men. And those are the people that are allowed to be heroes. And every time you say maybe someone else could be a hero too, you're sort of pushing against that headwind. We're trained to be that way. That's the way the books are. That's the way so many movies are and so many stories. That those are who the heroes are. And, Harry Potter's a hero. You can have Hermione, who's the friend, but she's not the prime one. So how do we change that narrative? How do we get to the point that it's okay for us to be heroes, so the rest of the world can look at us and say, oh, that could be a hero. That African-American lesbian detective can be the kind of hero I want to read about. The transgender police detective can be the hero I want to read about. That's a hard thing to do because people want to make us categories and they want their hierarchies. I think we've certainly seen that in the current political climate, that the huge pushback is that they don't want us in that space. That so many people that want to be that particular thing. So it's how do we keep pushing that? I know there's a lot of goodwill among a fair number of mystery writers. It's really been a challenge for me. For a long time, I was a lesbian mystery writer, and even though I didn't want to think of myself that way, I realized that I was like, oh, I'm not going to go to the big mystery conferences. I mean, I did about, in the 90s, and I remember sitting there and having to make that choice. Do I say that I write a lesbian, or do I not say it? I have to come out at it. And I did, and then on the signing afterward, Rob Burns was the only person that came up to my table to get a book. Thank you, Rob Burns. And so, yes. And so, those kind of experiences, so I said, okay, I'm just going to go off and do my own stuff. And it's hard when you're, to keep putting yourself out there, to keep saying, I have a space at this table, to walk into that, new author breakfast, when you're with, the cozy writing about, their caramel factory and the kind of stuff, and you're sitting going, well, I write, this hard noir lesbian, private eye, and you can just see them over breakfast going, okay. And I think it's hard along the way, and I think particularly if you're lesbian, because most of a lot of the readers are women, and women get hit over the head with, what are you, a lesbian? You don't like men? So we have these multiple cultural different things, and it's, I don't like to blame individuals for institutions. I don't want to say, those women are just homophobic when they're caught in this heterosexist institution that says if you're not feminine enough, if your voice is too shrill, you can't be the president of the United States. If you don't, if you don't act right, you're not a woman. And the quick way to say that is, oh, you're a lesbian. And so when you come to that moment of you leisure time, how do you choose? And so how do we overcome that? How do we say if you're black, you're as important and as likely to be a hero? If you're lesbian, if you're gay, you should be the heroes as well.
So there's some research that white women read male-to-male romance, and a huge cohort of them buy those books.
Yeah.
But they will not read lesbian romance. It's something about, I don't know, I think they're going to get turned or something. I don't know. I don't know how to go about that. When I'm in the mystery writer's room with the read, so I did the speed dating thing about your kind, so I talked to 18 tables, about 81 people, most of them white women. Yeah. And I was looking for the right formula to make their eyes light up. And so I put a lot of humor in my books. I put a lot of food in my books. I put some kind of safe kind of topics that invites them in, and then they get to the sex scene, and they can't get their heads.
Then you got hooked.
Yeah, no, I don't know about that. Yeah. So I think there's a way. I learned in public broadcasting, and I hope nobody will take offense at this. I learned in public broadcasting how to use my blackness to manipulate white people and to use white men to get stuff done that I need to get done. So, I was a vice president at my station in Detroit, and I was a senior vice president at my station in Washington, D.C., and I had a lot of white men work for me. And I invited them to have the power, because I knew the power was not in saying, you can go out and take that meeting. I had the control. You can have some power, but what you really want is control. It's easy for you to have a card with a title on it that shows that you have power, but if you don't have control, you don't have anything. So I'm going to use those same techniques, in this mystery writing world to help people understand that they're not going to get burned or killed, and they're going to get a great story, because I understand the pastiche, and I understand the intricacies of writing mysteries and what mystery writers want. So you're going to get that, but you'll also get a little glimpse into the life of a black lesbian woman who is not so different from you, except that she sleeps with this woman. So that's how I'm doing it. And let me say one more thing. Young adult novels are really making headway in diversity.
Yeah. They're the biggest group of
They are
readers.
Really grabbing new readers, and they're, there's a lot of young men and women, but they're kind of fearless about it. This whole own voices hashtag, if you are writing from a place of authenticity, I'm writing about the people who are like me as an African American author or as an Asian American author or Latinx author, and I think that's really helping the whole genre and the whole literary enterprise.
Gene, Mystery Scene magazine said, quote, "Roots of Murder combines a gripping mystery with well-honed literary fiction. Roots of Murder did two new things for you. One, it introduced a straight female detective named Nell McGraw. And two, you used the pen name R. Gene Reed.
Yes.
Why both? Why both things?
Well, some of it was that in the publishing world, you always, your author name is the publisher's going to look at, okay, how many did your last book sell? And so under the J.M. Redmann, I was selling at the lesbian pace. And my publisher, Midnight Inc., who went under, which is why the books are sort of in limbo right now. Not because of me. And so they felt like, okay, just use a different name, and I'm fine. And the reason that I wrote this book was it was a story I wanted to tell, but I couldn't tell it through the Mickey Knight story. And I grew up in a small town on the go close to Mississippi. And the story in Roots of Murder is what happens to a small fictional town, which is kind of based on the one that I grew up in, when they discover skeletons that are probably from the Civil Rights era. You know, what happens to this town? What sort of skeletons, what sort of things are buried? And it was, in a lot of ways, it was written for white people to try and explain to what happened in the Civil Rights era. We certainly know about the murders. We know Cheney, Swerner, and Goodman. We know Medgar Evers. We know all that. But a huge amount of property was also transferred from African American owners to white owners. So when the white owners suddenly decided that that's valuable land, there were ways that they could get that property from African Americans. And so the violence, the levels of violence that happened, the levels of loss that happened for a community that really had no law. You know, if you lived in the South or even parts of the North, if you were part of an African American community, a white person could pretty much do what they wanted to. And there were no consequences. And so I wanted to write a book that sort of examined what happened, how did it come through, you know, the ways it comes through the generations. And I couldn't do that in a Mickey Knight book. I couldn't go back to the small Mississippi town. And like I said, my parents were journalists, and so Nell McGraw is based very loosely on someone that my mother might have been. And what she might have done in that situation. Because she was, you know, a strong Yankee with, you know, the kind of morals and background. I remember when in 8th grade, when the schools in Mississippi were still segregated, this is again how old I am, that one of my teachers said, well, ask your parents about a historical figure that really influenced them. And my mother said Eleanor Roosevelt. You know, and I didn't quite get what the true meaning of Eleanor Roosevelt, because, you know, I was just an 8th grade kid, and when you're a child, you're locked out of this world. You don't see the damage. You know, I didn't see the fact that the beach I could go to as a child was a segregated beach. And the reason I could go there because I'm white, and the black children in my town could not go there because they were black. You know, and recognizing that, and I felt like I need to do something, even in a small way, to talk about this. As a white person, it's my obligation to try and talk about this and remind people of this world and remind people of the damage that hasn't gone away.
We're going to hear from both of our authors in just a moment, but while they're reading, please, I invite the audience to think of questions of anything that I have not asked, because there will be a Q&A to follow.
Something